very nice to have you in this webinar with us, and thank you very much for making time for us.
Thank you.
Thank you. Great to be with you.
Then, like I said, I have just introduced you in Japanese, but maybe I'd like you to do a little bit of a self-introduction, if I could ask you to do that. So first off, with you, Amit, you are the CEO of the GIIN, and then GIIN has been working in the field of impact investing for over a decade now. And today, since the topic is new capitalism, I think there are people in the audience who are not familiar with the impact investing to begin with. So with that in mind, could you give us a short self-introduction of yourself and the organization, please?
Absolutely. And then first, let me just say thank you to you, Katsuji-san, for and to SIMI for inviting me and for hosting this great discussion. I'm incredibly honored to be here. And as you mentioned, I have had the chance to come and speak about impact investing in Japan, and I look forward to the day when I can return and participate with the wonderful community there, thinking about how we can have the greatest impact with our investment capital. From our perspective at the GIIN, just to begin, if you could pull up the first slide, we are a nonprofit organization that supports a global network. Our vision is that impact, we envision a world where impact is integrated into all financial decisions, where impact just becomes the new normal. And we now see all investors, who are incorporating impact into the way they think about very important fundamentals like success, performance, value, and their fiduciary duty. And I'll come back to those topics, but just as some background, our network now includes over just under 400 organizations around the world. And they're spread across 50 countries. So we have members active on 6 continents. And the way we define impact investments are investments designed to make a positive, measurable social or environmental impact alongside a financial return. Now there's a lot of growth in impact investing around the world. And on the next slide, we have some data on the size and scale of the market. Our latest data estimates the global market is $715 billion. It's actually been a couple of years since we published this data, and we plan on publishing an updated version later this year. On the right-hand side, you'll see some important information around what types of returns are investors seeking. And we see the vast majority of investors are seeking risk-adjusted rates of return. And a significant portion are also thinking about returns that are at least close to market rates. And then there's a portion that's really interesting that's also open to below market rates of return. And so we see a range of investment preferences and priorities, but the vast majority of the capital we're speaking to is commercial capital from pension funds, insurance companies, asset managers, private equity funds, and boutique firms and beyond, and also like family offices and individual wealth, with a focus on generating positive, measurable impact alongside that financial return. Now, if you can pull the slides down when you have a moment, but just as a brief background on what the GIIN does, we have been, since we were founded, have been helping to promote impact investing around the world and helping to increase the scale and the effectiveness of impact investing. And that's where I want to speak to the importance of thinking about the overall economic system and new capitalism. What fundamentally motivates investors to be impact investors is they want to address some society's fundamental issues, like the climate crisis, addressing poverty, advancing gender equity, and other topics like this that are so critical to do at a systemic level. And if we're thinking about having an impact, not just on transactions, but trying to address global systemic issues, it's incredibly important for us to also think about what is the role of investment capital in shaping a better economic system? One that works for all people, one that works for the planet, and also one that works for investors and the people who are participating in that economy. And that's where we saw an incredibly important need to not just think about impact investing in terms of transactions, instruments, or portfolios, but rather how does impact investment contribute to a better economic system that is more sustainable and more inclusive. And that's what's really led us to work on New Capitalism. And we can talk more about that, but just so you have a sense for what we do in impact investing, we do support our global network of 400 or so organizations around the world. We work with them to help provide educational programming and other activities. We also do a lot of work around research, as you saw from the market sizing data and our global survey that helps highlight insights in the market that equips investors to be more effective at achieving impact. And then we develop tools and resources, particularly around impact measurement and management, some topics that Katsuji-san is incredibly familiar with. And we do work to help create standards and strategies that investors can use to measure, manage, and optimize their impact. Much of that work is housed in a system called IRIS Plus, which is IRIS with a plus sign, that really helps investors translate their impact intentions. So an intention to help mitigate climate change or to help promote gender equity, and translate those intentions to real measurable metrics that they can use to better understand their performance. But I'll close my introduction just by saying I'm so grateful for this opportunity to speak about this topic because it is so important with the challenges that the world is facing that we do think about how we drive systemic solutions and have a conversation about how our economic system, the one that is brought us to this point, is not the best one that will serve us going forward into the future. And I think it's incredibly important that we have a global conversation about this topic. So thank you.
Thank you, Amit. That really contained a lot of rich information already about the work, but thank you very much for your leadership so far and beyond. And it's great to have the GIIN leading this effort for a systemic change, which I'm sure we are going to talk further about. So let me turn to Fran now. So Fran, your turn to introduce yourself and your organization. And please, for the interpreter's sake, try to speak slower than normal. Thank you, Fran.
Well, I speak quickly normally, so I'll really have to remind myself to slow down for the benefit of the interpreter and the audience. So hello, good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Just delighted to be with you today. I'm excited to be in conversation with you, Katsuji-san, and my friend and colleague, Amit Buri, who leads the GIIN. Again, I'm Fran Siegel, and I serve as president of the U.S. Impact Investing Alliance, which is an organization seeking to advance the role that impact investing can play in manifesting a more equitable economic system. We define impact investment very consistently with the GIIN definition that Amit just shared, investments that generate measurable social, economic, or environmental impact alongside financial returns across asset classes globally. So we look at the capital markets, the global capital markets, private asset classes, and everything in between. One kind of shorthand way that we refer to it, especially when we are speaking with the administration and in Congress, is we say that impact investors seek to leverage private capital for public good. But regardless of how we respectively define impact investing, the truth is that every investment has an impact. But today, those impacts are largely opaque to the investor and to other stakeholders like employees, suppliers, and communities. And in many ways, I think about the impact investing movement being in part an attempt to close that gap in transparency and bring broader accountability to our financial system, our global financial system. And the only way that that'll be possible is with a strong ecosystem capable of supporting the growth and the scaling of the field of impact investing with impact integrity. And that's where the work of field builders like the Alliance and the GIIN and many of the organizations, the hosting organizations do as well. The Alliance in particular engages in three main ways. So thank you for showing this first slide. The first is through public policy advocacy, which we'll spend some time talking about a bit later. The second is catalyzing investor action. And the third is movement building. So through our advocacy work, we work with federal policymakers in Washington, D.C. to ensure that U.S. laws and regulations enable and encourage the flow of capital for impact. So for example, we co-lead the Coalition on Inclusive Economic Growth with an organization that I know that you know called B-Lab. And we bring together over 60 impact investor and business organizations, including the GIIN, in support of a shared vision for how government and the private sector can advance a more equitable economic system. I'm happy to share a bit more about this Coalition on Inclusive Economic Growth later, but I just wanted to raise it as an example of the importance of coalition building, particularly as it relates to public policy. The Alliance, again, works directly with investor groups such as private foundations and other charitable asset owners, high net worth individuals, and wealth platforms to form a common understanding of the opportunities for impact investing. And in some ways, the groups that we work with are very complementary to the ones that Amit shared that the GIIN highlights. And finally, we work to build the movement of impact investing in the United States and globally, working with our partners like the GIIN and the Global Steering Group on Impact Investing to help coordinate our efforts and refine the narratives around impact investing worldwide. And I will say that shout out to Masa and the National Advisory Board of Japan. We serve at the Alliance as the US National Advisory Board, so the US representative to the Global Steering Group on Impact Investing. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Fran, for the self-introduction. Maybe our staff can also share the link of the GSG for us, which Fran just alluded to. And the name Masa is Uo Masataka-san. He's the vice chair of the GSG NAB, National Advisory Board of Japan. So for those who are not familiar with it, GSG has been really at the forefront of the global movement, and Japan is no exception in participating in that global movement to really make impact a mainstay of any financial transactions and activities. So with that, maybe I can go to a question. I pose a question to you both about this movement nature of impact investing. This is where the Japanese people might have a lot of question marks, actually. Impact investing is a movement. What do you mean by that? And of course, we understand from your self-introduction respectively that impact, seeking impact is really taking place with an eye toward the systemic economic change. But what do you mean impact investing is a movement, and how can we understand it? It's a commercial activity, isn't it? You know, at the end of the day, no? And how can people in finance or as a sector or as an industry can be a leader in this movement? Because in Japan, many people in the financial sector tend to identify themselves as an industry that is receptive to the needs of the business. So when there is a need for financial return, of course, the financial sector is there to help them to really maximize the return. When there is a need for impact, of course, that's where they can come in and try to support their business activities to really create more impact. But it's really up to them, they say. They tend to say. People in the finance they are on the receiving side of the larger societal needs, and they can definitely be receptive of the different changing social environment. But they are the movement builder. That's a question. So how would you respond to that kind of question marks all over their head? Maybe I can start with you, Amit, and then move on to Fran.
Thank you, and it is a good question because I understand how do you think about, on one hand, what is a practice of investment and an approach and a methodology.
Slowly, Amit.
Okay. With thinking about how this could also be a movement, which we associate with things other than investment typically. And here's why that is important. When we think about having an economy or a capitalist system that better serves all people and the planet, one that is sustainable and inclusive, that means we need to change some of the drivers of the economy and how we think about and measure success of economic activity. Coming to the investment level, you are absolutely correct. Impact investing is an approach to investment. But the reason why it is, we talk about it also as a movement, is that if we are trying to address big global issues or even national issues, it is important that we actually move significantly more capital to address those areas that the markets have not historically been addressing. So that could be addressing the need for the energy transition. It could be in more inclusive services, financial services, healthcare, education, and beyond. And what is so important is that as we're thinking about a different purpose for the economy, when it comes to investment level, we're actually thinking about changing the way we think about the purpose of capital, of investment capital. And what I mean by that is historically, we would think about the purpose of investment capital as generating more returns for the owners of that capital, the investors themselves. What impact investing is fundamentally doing is adding other objectives to investment. So when going back to the definition, it is financial return, but alongside positive measurable impact. So in essence, we're defining success differently, which is a very different way of thinking about investment. And that's where the movement piece comes in, is that we're actually changing mindsets, changing the way that people think about the role of capital in society. Now, this is new to many, but I think one thing that is important to highlight is that it does actually speak in many ways to traditional values. Like the philosophy from Mr. Shibusawa, who often spoke about how businesses need to support other stakeholders, employees, customers, communities, and the environment, is very much the way many impact investors think about this, except that it's the investors who would put money into those companies that are trying to have a positive impact beyond the returns they generate for their investors. What we see now globally,
Yeah, just to interject one thing here. It is important for you to talk about the positive measurable impact alongside the financial return. I think many in Japan also has some confusion about this area of the impact investing, and many feels that impact investing, that's a part of a CSR, corporate social responsibility. It's something you do not to really seek a financial return, but seek something else. So it's a kind of trade-off between the two. But you're saying that's not the case.
That's correct. And if you recall one of the slides that we shared earlier, based on our research, the vast majority of impact investors are seeking risk-adjusted rates of return, or market or commercial returns. And so that is where the bulk of the market is, and that's where we expect to see the greatest amount of growth.
Yeah,
I do want to highlight that there are some impact investments that are financially viable, but not as attractive as what the markets would typically expect. And there was that 15% that I mentioned in that slide of investors who are open to below market rates of return. So that's part of the market, but a minority of the overall market.
Minority. Okay. Sorry, I interjected. You are talking about the global movement. Yeah. Do you want to go back to your point? Or?
Sure. Just one last point about this being kind of a movement. That when the GIIN was founded, just as one marker of growth, we had just over 20 members, and that felt very successful at the time. There were pioneering people around the world who were starting to innovate around this approach to impact investment.
And this was 2008, 2006?
2009, yeah. So we were, so when we officially launched, and that was an incredibly exciting time for us. But at the time, the term impact investing was not in use around the world. So it was a new brand and a new, and in many ways, a new kind of approach to how you could think about the role of capital. I should mention there are people who've been doing this for many decades all over the world, and it was about connecting them. If they were focused on microfinance or community investment or sustainable agriculture, connecting them to a broader theme of how do we think about impact across asset classes, as Fran spoke to, and across sectors and around the world. And that's what's been very powerful about the movement thinking is that, as I shared earlier, our membership has now grown to 400, and so it's significantly bigger than it was then. But that's only one indicator of growth. We see what's happening in the broader market, where we now see $715 billion in assets under management. But even more importantly, we now see impact investing as a strategy adopted by almost every major asset manager and wealth manager in the world, and increasingly institutional investors, pension funds, endowments, insurance companies, and even corporate treasuries. So this is a concept that has not yet achieved its peak in terms of size, and it's very much in a state of growth and shifting the way people think about the role of investment in our society.
Right. So the movement goes from a phase to a different phase, and I think you just mentioned its growth and then changing phases to now the more mainstream investors, financial institutions, pension funds, paying more and more attention to impact. So that's a great point. So Fran, over to you. How would you describe this question I posed of the power of finance as a movement?
Yeah, this is a great question, and Amit talked about the purpose of money and finance in society, and I also think of it as a questioning the nature of value, relative value between and among geographies, urban, rural, global north, global south. Folks that live at the bottom of the pyramid, folks that live at the tippy top of the pyramid. And I think that, some time ago, numbers came out from the United Nations that in order to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals by 2030, which is right around the corner, we would need to invest $7 trillion a year for impact. And we're nowhere near that. And so I think what that serves to illustrate is that the magnitude of challenges that we face as a global society, as a planet, require cross-sectoral partnership. But if you look at the private foundations in the United States give about $60 billion a year in grants. US foreign aid is maybe a small multiple of that. But the capital markets, the global capital markets are, something like 200 trillion. So we need a cross-sectoral partnership to achieve that. So that is how I talk about impact investing and the imperative of impact investing to folks that are motivated by these global challenges. But when I talk to finance folks, I also talk about just the numbers and the realities of population growth, climate change, dwindling natural resources, income inequality, and the other intractable challenges that Amit talked about, and how those translate very, very quickly into business realities and investment realities. And so I think that it's not surprising that that finance is sitting up and taking notice all around the world, including in Japan. And I think Amit and I both agree that this will happen more and more. In the United States, Amit mentioned institutional asset owners as a driver for change. We work with a lot of private foundations that have been leading the exponential growth in impact investing. For example, in 2017, Ford Foundation, where the US Impact Investing Alliance was incubated, committed to $1 billion of its then $13 billion endowment to impact investing in a historic move. And since then, many other foundations have committed part or all of their endowments for impact. Amit mentioned pension funds as serving a major driver of growth in impact investing and ESG investing, including in Europe, including some state level pension funds in the United States, like in the states of California and New York. But I would be remiss if I didn't call out that Japan's government pension investment fund, as you folks know, the largest in the world, which has been a tremendous leader in this space. And as a universal asset owner, grappling with these big systemic risks that Amit and I are talking about, and calling on asset managers to integrate environmental, social, and governance or ESG analysis into their investment decisions. On the retail side, we also see an unprecedented wealth transfer coming to younger generations over the next several decades. We expect to see about $30 to $40 trillion of wealth transferring first to women and then to millennials. And we know that millennials have an unprecedented interest and demand for transparency and accountability. And we believe that that will also have profound effects for the broader financial systems, including wealth advisory, who are already having clients leave because certain wealth platforms aren't able to meet high net worth individuals where they are. I will just say a bit more about building on what Amit was saying about the conversations of the future of capitalism, which is also gaining a lot of momentum in the United States, and specifically around the fact that shareholder primacy has run its course, so maximizing shareholder value at all costs, and that it's time to restructure the rules, regulations, and norms so that those who hold power, in our economic system consider the impacts on a broader set of stakeholders, including investors, but also including workers, communities, and the physical environment. And I think the new capitalism movement in Japan is something that we can really learn from in the United States. We have had a couple of big notable announcements in the United States. For example, in 2019, the Business Roundtable had a commitment signed by 181 CEOs of the largest US companies to advance stakeholder capitalism. And we also saw, in response to the crises in 2020 and 2021, Amit mentioned this, corporates pledged north of $50 billion to racial equity. And some are undergoing civil rights audits to improve their overall culture and practices regarding underserved and marginal groups. So there has been a bit of a reckoning of corporate accountability in the United States. And again, we are eager to draw upon lessons from the Japanese economic system in which stakeholder accountability has been better embedded. Thank you.
Thank you, Fran, for that, sharing your thoughts. Maybe you could also talk a little bit about this slide
Sure.
Of your alliance.
Yes, absolutely. Happy to. I'd love to talk about it in the context of public policy. We authored a public policy brief in the lead up to the 2020 presidential election, and it was called Private Capital, Public Good. And the goal was really to place impact investing principles that Amin and I have been sharing with you at the forefront of policymakers' minds as they work to build a just and equitable recovery from the global pandemic, from the economic crisis that ensued, from the racial protests that had been and are ongoing in the United States. And we thought that it was particularly important to emphasize that this was a movement for government to lead with coordinated partnership from private sector. So this gets back to your question about whose responsibility is it to address these issues. And we fundamentally believe that the incumbent system of capitalism and shareholder primacy and the current framework around corporate governance is in part giving rise to some of these intractable problems that we are seeking to solve. And so a cross-sectoral partnership between the private sector, the public sector, and philanthropy and NGOs is essential. And we organized our policy recommendations around two main themes that you can see on this slide. The first, and we've been talking about it quite a lot, is accelerating the transition to stakeholder capitalism. And the second is transforming community investing practices to confront inequality. So the first theme, I won't necessarily reiterate it, but we've talked about this transition from short-term extractive behaviors by corporations and by financial institutions at the expense of other stakeholders, and moving toward an economic system that benefits all stakeholders. And so here we are working with regulators, and I'm happy to talk in greater specificity later if it's interesting, to support policies like mandated and standardized corporate disclosure on things like climate-related risk and workforce diversity data. The second theme, which may be slightly less relevant to the Japanese audience, but I thought I would share it anyway for reference, is how the public and private sectors invest in positive impact outcomes in communities in the United States that have been underserved by the current system, chronically underserved. So those are underserved communities like urban communities, rural communities, and I know there has been some rural investment initiatives in Japan. Native American communities. So we have a suite of government programs, regulations, and tax incentives that have helped create what we call a community development finance ecosystem that supports local economies across the country. And in the early days, this ecosystem of local banks and local nonprofits and economic development agencies sprang into action to support small businesses, workers, families, nonprofit organizations. And so when we think about this kind of the alliances theory of change, we think about the role that impact investors have to play in driving more equitable economic growth at the intersection of these ideas, where you have top-down structural change in the form of federal regulation, and large asset owners and financial actors and other actors making private sector calls for change, but also bottom-up revitalization. And we think that durable change and transformational change can happen at the intersection of these levers.
Great. Okay. Thank you for that, Fran. I think people in the audience, if you like to see the policy brief itself, this is the website. I can paste the website into the chat as well. So I would like to ask Fran in a few minutes about so what happened. Like you mentioned, you prepared for this in the lead up to the presidential election almost 2 years ago, no, 1.5 years ago. So I'd like to get some update and then, how the government is responding to that. But before doing so, I would like to turn to Amit. And, I have pulled up this page, which is a part of the GIIN website. Okay, so I pasted that onto the chat as well. So, okay, so from your intervention, we now understand that the movement nature of impact investing. But what is this on this website of GIIN's New Capitalism Initiative? And then I know that Fran has also been involved in it too. On a more concrete terms, what is it that you are doing with this particular initiative or any other related initiatives that you're part of?
Sure. Absolutely, thank you. And as background, I think one thing that is very important to understand in this moment is that the people interested in changing our economic system are very different than what we would have talked about maybe 10 years ago. 10 years ago, the major voices around shifting our economic system would have been activists, environmental activists, social activists, NGOs, and others. Today, what's different is we now see leaders of industry actively recognizing that our current system is not going to work in the future. That includes major investors, it includes billionaire technology entrepreneurs, CEOs of major global multinationals, multinational corporations, the World Economic Forum, the Business Roundtable in the United States, and increasing the G7 and beyond. So what we've seen is a critique and a recognition that the current system will not be good enough to serve a sustainable planet and a sustainable society in the future. But what we also need is a version of the new economic system or the new capitalism. And that's why we've been doing a few different projects, including this new capitalism initiative that we think are so important. One of the projects that is global in nature is a series of conversations that we've been hosting in the form of podcasts called The Next Normal. These are available on Apple and Spotify and elsewhere, but it's engaging people around the world and starting to articulate what our future economic system could look like from the perspective of a better economy from different perspectives, including from healthcare, from environmental sustainability, from the perspective of food systems, from the perspective of corporate leaders, philanthropists, activists, and beyond. And that has been one way of hosting a conversation of diverse voices to start to shape a view of what our future economic system could look like globally. The New Capitalism Project has been a much more active engagement with partners like Fran and the U.S. Impact Investing Alliance to start to articulate a more concrete view on what our future economy could look like, what new capitalism could be, and what it would take to get from where we are today to that future vision. And it's been incredibly exciting because we've had representatives from the public policy, from labor unions, from business groups, from indigenous groups, and from think tanks thinking about social equity, all coming together to start to do the work of shaping a perspective and a point of view on what our economy could look like in the future and how that would work in practice. This is work that still continues, so it's not a complete project, but it's been very interesting, as Fran was saying, of bringing together people across sectors, different perspectives who all have a role, who all have a stake in our economy and in our society, to work together in helping to shape a common vision for our capital future, as well as an action agenda to making that happen.
Wonderful. Okay, so So would you say everybody is an activist now?
I don't think so yet, but I think everyone is recognizing that they need to invest for the future, and that to have the future that they want for society, for the children, for the grandchildren, we have to change the way that business works. We have to change the way that investment works, and we have to change the relationship between our economy and the private sector and the broader civil society and the planet. I think that shared recognition has opened up a space for collaboration that's incredibly interesting.
Great, wonderful. Thank you. Now I turn to you, Fran, and ask you about, so what happened in the 15 months or so since you published the policy brief, and then, if you can be candid, your assessment of the current U.S. administration, around these efforts. And of course, since you are part of the New Capitalism initiative as well, if you have a comment or two on that initiative, we would like to welcome that. So over to you, Fran.
Thank you. And I will say it has been an honor to be on the New Capitalism journey with Amit and the other leaders who are part of that group. And I would say that we have some very bold ambitions about how to achieve not just stakeholder capitalism, but what exists beyond stakeholder capitalism, which might be a longer term affair to effectuate. But it's been really exciting to look at existing power dynamics in all sectors and try to understand what it really means to create a more equitable economic system. So I'm happy to talk, and I'm sure Amit is as well, dig in a little bit more in the Q&A if that's of interest to the audience. So yes, on the policy front. So the Alliance officially launched in the middle of 2017, but I took over the US National Advisory Board right before the 2016 presidential election. President Trump was elected, and it was a time that was particularly challenging in Washington, divisive. But we have had a long-standing belief, and it has been borne out, that impact investing principles resonate with policymakers on both sides of the aisle, both sides of across the political spectrum. And that regardless of ideology, most policymakers find the intersection of impact objectives and public policy goals to be very compelling. So whether we think about the creation of quality jobs, affordable and safe housing, healthy and thriving communities, there's something to bring different parties together. I would say that some issues, particularly those related to climate change or stakeholder capitalism more broadly, can be more politicized and really require more nuanced messaging depending on the audience. So all that to say that we think that impact objectives have bipartisan appeal. There was a recent study by Just Capital that found that the overwhelming majority of Americans, regardless of their political leanings, support public policies such as mandated disclosures by corporations on environmental, social, or governance ESG issues. So we remain cautiously optimistic that the political dynamics, though they may shift over time, we think that with adequate engagement, adequate education from our field, that impact investing principles will increasingly be embedded in public policy. More specifically to your question about the private capital public good recommendations, we've had a couple wins for the field since President Biden was elected to office. So late 2020, early 2021 was his inauguration. On the stakeholder capitalism side, the US Securities and Exchange Commission, the SEC, which regulates the capital markets and investing practices in the United States, recently put forth proposed regulations requiring public companies to report on climate-related risks and impacts This is a hard-fought, long-standing battle that we have waged in the impact investing community to bring impact transparency to investing. And I will say humbly that the United States trails behind other jurisdictions like the European Union, the UK, Japan, New Zealand, London, as I mentioned, had relatively recently made an announcement. So we lag behind in transparency and disclosure on non-financial factors for corporations and investors. That said, there needs to be a global convergence coming together around impact standards and reporting regimes. But at the moment, we're really encouraged to see several jurisdictions like the United States, like Japan, adopt the Task Force on Climate-Related Disclosures, that framework. It's called TCFD. And just weeks after the SEC's announcement, which was just happened a couple of weeks ago, maybe a month ago, the newly formed International Sustainability Standards Board at the IFRS Foundation released its climate and sustainability related disclosure drafts for public comment, also based on the TCFD framework. And we believe that it will be eventually adopted across the countries within IFRS's jurisdiction. So corporate disclosure has been, it's not a win yet, but I think it's in the process of being a win. There will also be forthcoming proposed rules on human capital management, which I know is something that the Japanese government takes very seriously about the value of human capital. The Biden administration has demonstrated a commitment to equity and inclusion as well, and has been doing a lot of work around support for quality jobs and workers. And finally, there's a bipartisan effort to flow government and private sector capital into US industries, US supply chains, and research and development, recognizing the weaknesses in the economic base and the supply chains that the pandemic and related crises revealed. So I will say that public policy is a team sport, and this progress would not have been possible without our partners in the field advancing this cohesive vision that Ahmed and I have been talking about for an inclusive, equitable economy. I mentioned earlier that we co-founded and co-lead a group of over 60 impact-oriented business and investor organizations with B-Lab called the Coalition on Inclusive Economic Growth. In a moment, I'll put that link in the chat. And on behalf of the coalition, recently we partnered with the Department of Commerce, the Department of Labor, Department of Transportation, and the Treasury Department to host a federal government convening on equitable economic growth that brought together officials from Treasury, Labor, the agencies that I mentioned, the White House, and nearly 150 private sector leaders to discuss opportunities for collaboration. So working in coalition is something that we are doing in greater earnest now, and feel that it's important in order to achieve the public policy objectives that we hope can fuel the transition to a more equitable system.
Great. Thank you for all those concrete work that you have been doing, both of you, Ahmed and Fran.